Welcome, dream seekers and insomniacs. I'm your host, the Night Weaver, guiding you through soul-seeping, mind-haunting stories under a rain-soaked darkness. Now, take a deep breath, let the rhythm of the rain settle you, and follow me into the shadows beyond. The next day dawned gray, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. The familiar warmth of the morning sun was muted, diffused through clouds that hadn't been there the night before. Even the air felt wrong, heavy and thick, despite the arid landscape surrounding us. We packed up in silence, each casting wary glances toward the cliffside where the petroglyphs waited, their ancient markings somehow darker against the pale stone than they'd been yesterday. Marissa hadn't said a word since the night before. Her usual bright energy, the enthusiasm that had made her one of my best graduate students, was gone, replaced by something hollow and distant. Her face was gaunt, her eyes red and unfocused, like someone who'd seen something they couldn't forget and didn't want to remember. Each time she looked at the cliff face, she would flinch and look away quickly, as if afraid of what she might see if she stared too long. The archaeological expedition had seemed simple enough at first. 3 weeks of documenting previously undiscovered Native American rock art in a remote part of the Sonoran Desert. As the lead archaeologist, I'd chosen this site carefully, intrigued by satellite images showing unusual geometric patterns in the cliff faces. Marissa and Gabe, my two most promising doctoral candidates, had jumped at the chance to join the research team. Now I wished I'd never brought them here. By midday, exhaustion had settled deep into our bones. The weight of what we'd experienced the night before pressed down on us like a physical thing. Gabe moved through the motions mechanically, his movements jerky and uncertain. I caught him flinching whenever the wind picked up, like he was afraid the whispers would return. Those terrible, impossible whispers that had filled the night air with promises and threats we couldn't quite understand. But the whispers didn't return. The silence, somehow, was even worse. As the sun rose higher in the pewter sky, I began to try to rationalize what had happened. This land was dry and empty, full of heat and haze and strange noises that bounced off the cliffs, making it easy to believe we weren't alone. Sound played tricks out here. I'd studied enough desert archaeology to know that. The landscape distorted perception. I could convince myself of that much. We were tired, dehydrated perhaps, our minds playing tricks in the isolation of the desert. But then Marissa spoke, her voice weak and hoarse, shattering my attempts at rationalization. "They want us gone," she said, barely above a whisper, and I noticed she was staring at the petroglyphs again, her eyes wide and haunted. Her hands trembled as she pointed, and I saw that her fingernails were broken and bloody, though I couldn't remember her hurting them. "Who wants us gone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, to be the rational professor I was supposed to be. But my voice shook despite my efforts. Marissa didn't answer directly. She just pointed to a section of the cliff we hadn't documented yet. At first, it looked like any other set of carvings we'd been studying, lines and spirals etched into the rock, faintly darker than the surrounding stone. But as I stared, something about them seemed wrong. The lines twisted in unnatural ways, forming shapes I couldn't quite make out. Faces, maybe, or hands reaching out toward us. The longer I looked, the more the patterns seemed to shift, to change, to become something else entirely. I felt a strange pull, like something in the stone was calling me, trying to drag me closer. The patterns began to swirl and dance, and I could swear I heard something. A faint humming, perhaps, or the echo of distant voices. My vision blurred and I had to tear my eyes away, my pulse racing, sweat cold on my skin despite the desert heat. "We're leaving," I said, my voice coming out more like a gasp. "Now." Gabe nodded, his face pale beneath his tan, and we hurried to pack the last of our equipment. Our careful archaeological documentation was forgotten in our haste to get away. Marissa didn't protest, but as we started down the trail, she kept glancing over her shoulder, her gaze drawn back to the cliff, as if some part of her was still there, still listening to whatever voices we'd heard in the night. We made it about a mile down the trail before Gabe stopped short. He stood there, staring at something on the ground, his face twisted with confusion and growing horror. "What is it?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended, fear making me harsh. He didn't respond, just pointed. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop, the world tilting sideways beneath my feet. There, in the dusty soil, were footprints. Not just any footprints. They were ours, the same tracks we'd left on the way up, clear and distinct in the dry earth. But they were facing the wrong direction, as if we'd somehow doubled back without realizing it. "No," I whispered, shaking my head in denial. We didn't turn around." "We didn't," Gabe said, his voice shaking. "I know we didn't. I've been watching the sun. We've been walking east, away from the cliffs. These tracks, this isn't possible." Panic clawed at my throat as I looked around, trying to orient myself. But the desert stretched out in every direction, endless and featureless, and the cliffs loomed behind us like silent sentinels, watching our every move. The sun seemed to have moved wrong in the sky, casting shadows that pointed in impossible directions. "Let's go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, to be the leader they needed. "We'll just retrace our steps. We'll find the trail." But as we walked, the landscape began to shift around us. The ground seemed to tilt and sway beneath our feet, and the cliffs loomed closer, even though we were moving away from them. I felt as though we were walking in circles, trapped in some twisted maze with no way out. The very air seemed to thicken, making each step harder than the last. The whispers returned then, soft and insistent, calling my name over and over. "Dr. Collins, come back. See." They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air with their terrible promise. Gabe clutched his head, his face twisted with pain, and Marissa just stared blankly ahead, her eyes dull and unfocused. I tried to shut out the voices, tried to focus on the path ahead, but the whispers grew louder, filling my mind until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. And then, suddenly they stopped. I blinked, disoriented by the sudden silence, and found myself standing at the base of the cliff, staring up at the petroglyphs. We were back where we'd started, though we'd been walking away for what felt like hours. "No," I whispered, shaking my head in denial. We were walking away. We were going down the trail." But the cliff loomed above us, silent and unyielding, and the petroglyphs seemed to pulse in the fading light, their shapes shifting and twisting, forming strange alien patterns that made my head ache just to look at them. They weren't the simple geometric shapes and animal figures we'd come to study. They were something else entirely, something older, something wrong. Marissa let out a low, broken sob, and I turned to see her staring at the cliff, her face pale and streaked with tears. "They won't let us leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They want us to stay. Forever." Night fell, cold and merciless, and the desert around us seemed to close in, trapping us beneath the shadow of the cliffs. We huddled together, our backs pressed against the rock, as the darkness deepened and the stars appeared, cold and distant in the sky above. But even the familiar constellations seemed wrong, arranged in patterns I'd never seen before. The whispers began again, louder this time, filling the air with a cacophony of voices. They called our names, over and over, each voice overlapping with the next until it was impossible to tell them apart. They spoke in languages I'd never heard, ancient tongues that had no business being spoken in the modern world. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but the voices seemed to seep into my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. I could feel them inside me, twisting and writhing, digging into my memories, my fears, my regrets. They knew everything about me, every doubt, every failure, every dark thought I'd ever had. And then I saw it. A figure, pale and ghostly, standing at the edge of our dying firelight. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden in shadow, its eyes empty and hollow. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching us with a cold, unblinking gaze that seemed to pierce straight through to our souls. Marissa let out a choked gasp, and I realized she could see it too. She clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin, her face twisted with terror. What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the whispers that filled the air. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what it was, only that it was wrong, that it didn't belong in this world. It was something ancient, something malevolent, something that had been waiting in the darkness for centuries, waiting for us to come, to trespass, to disturb its rest. And now it was awake. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, its hollow eyes locked onto us. I could feel its gaze, cold and relentless, boring into my soul, stripping away every layer of protection, every defense. I could feel it peeling me open, exposing every fear, every doubt, every regret. Each step it took seemed to drain the warmth from the air, until even our breath froze in our lungs. I wanted to run, to scream, to escape, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. I was trapped, frozen in place, helpless in the face of its terrible power. The petroglyphs on the cliff face behind us began to glow with a sickly light, casting twisted shadows that danced and writhed like living things. Gabe let out a strangled cry, and I turned to see him clutching his head, his face contorted with pain. He fell to his knees, his body racked with convulsions, and I realized with horror that the figure was inside him, tearing him apart from the inside out. His eyes had gone black, empty, like the thing that watched us. Marissa screamed, a high, keening sound that echoed off the cliffs, and the figure turned its gaze on her, its empty eyes narrowing with a twisted, malevolent hunger. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could see darkness beginning to seep from the corners of her eyes. I grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet, and we ran, stumbling blindly through the darkness, the whispers chasing us, growing louder and louder, until they filled the air with a deafening roar. Behind us, I could hear Gabe's screams turning into something else, something inhuman. I don't know how long we ran, only that the whispers followed us, relentless and unforgiving. The desert stretched out before us, endless and empty, and the cliffs loomed behind us, dark and silent, a constant reminder of the horrors we'd left behind. Time seemed to lose all meaning. We might have been running for hours or days. We finally collapsed, gasping for breath, our bodies bruised and battered, our minds shattered by the terror we'd endured. When consciousness returned, we found ourselves on the edge of the desert, the cliffs a distant memory, their dark shapes fading into the morning light like a half-remembered nightmare. Marissa didn't speak. She just stared into the distance, her eyes empty, her face pale and drawn. Gabe was gone, lost to the darkness, his body claimed by the figure that had haunted us, that had followed us, that had refused to let us go. I knew somehow that he was still there, among the petroglyphs, his essence added to the ancient whispers that haunted those cursed cliffs. We made our way back to civilization, our bodies broken, our minds scarred by the horrors we'd witnessed. The university accepted my report about the tragic climbing accident that had claimed Gabe's life. What else could I tell them? The truth would have destroyed what remained of our careers, our sanity. We tried to go back to our lives, to pretend that nothing had happened. Marissa dropped out of the program and disappeared. I heard later that she'd moved to Alaska, as far from the desert as she could get. But the whispers never left us. They followed us, haunting our dreams, a constant reminder of the darkness we'd uncovered, the evil we'd awakened. And sometimes, late at night, I hear them calling my name, soft and insistent, echoing through the silence of my empty house. Dr. Collins, come back. See. I know they're waiting for me, out there in the desert, their hollow eyes watching, their twisted hands reaching. They want me to return, to join them in the darkness, to become one with the ancient horror that lurks among the petroglyphs. The same horror that humans have been carving warnings about for thousands of years, if only we'd known how to read them. And I know someday, I won't be able to resist. The pull grows stronger every day, the whispers more insistent. Sometimes I catch myself looking up flights to Arizona, my fingers hovering over the book button before I can stop myself. Because that's the true horror of the hollowed stones. Not that they kill you, but that they make you want to come back. They make you yearn for that terrible enlightenment, that awful knowledge that waits in the darkness. The desert is patient. It can wait. And when I finally return, I know I'll find Gabe there, his empty eyes watching, his twisted smile welcoming me home. After all, some mysteries are meant to stay buried. Some knowledge is meant to remain hidden. But once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. There's only the whispers, and the waiting, and the inevitable return to the hollowed stones. The desert had always been a hostile place, but in the drought of that summer, it had become something else entirely. The sun hung like a furious eye in the cloudless sky, beating down mercilessly on the cracked earth below. Even the air seemed sharp and punishing, as though each gust was trying to scour away anything that didn't belong. The wind carried fine particles of sand that stung exposed skin and found their way into every crevice, every fold of clothing. And for the first time since I'd started working in these harsh landscapes, I wasn't sure if I belonged. I was the project lead on a new water reclamation venture on a small Native American reservation, a place that had been experiencing severe water scarcity for the past year. The situation had grown desperate. Wells were running dry, crops were failing, and the community was struggling to maintain their way of life in this unforgiving environment. The plan was simple, at least on paper: drain part of a reservoir to feed into a larger system that could bring water to the nearby towns and reservation. It was a straightforward, well-mapped project, the kind I'd successfully completed dozens of times before in my 15 years of environmental engineering. But as I would come to learn, the land had other ideas, and some waters aren't meant to be disturbed. We'd barely begun setting up our equipment when our troubles started. The reservoir, known locally as Bitterwater, had a reputation, one I had arrogantly ignored in the planning stages. Engineers like me tend to dismiss local folklore as superstition, viewing the world through the lens of science and technology. To us, it was just another body of water, a resource to be managed and distributed. But to the locals, Bitterwater was something else entirely. Legend held that it was guarded by a watcher, a spirit who would take vengeance on anyone who disturbed the water. The stories were whispered to me only once, by an old woman who lived alone at the edge of the reservation. Her face was deeply lined, each wrinkle telling a story of hardship and survival in this unforgiving land. She'd approached me one evening as I was reviewing the site plans, her weathered hands clutching a walking stick carved with symbols I didn't recognize. "You take from the water, and he takes back," she said, her eyes clouded with something I couldn't name, fear perhaps, or resignation. "And he doesn't stop until the water is left alone." Her voice carried the weight of generations, of stories passed down through time, warnings ignored by those who thought they knew better. I'd shrugged off her words as superstition and fear of change, the kind of resistance I'd encountered on many projects before. Progress often faced opposition from those who clung to old ways of thinking. But as the days passed, as strange occurrences began to multiply, I began to wonder if there was more to her words than I wanted to believe. The memory of her warning would return to haunt me in the dark hours of the night, when the desert winds howled like lost souls across the empty landscape. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a shadow, a presence that seemed to defy the harsh desert sun. One of the workers, a young man named Carlos, experienced in his trade but new to this particular region, had noticed it while setting up the pumps along the reservoir's edge. His hands had been steady as he worked with the equipment, but his voice trembled when he told me what he'd seen. He told me he'd seen a tall, dark figure standing across the water, watching silently as he worked. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't come closer. It had simply stood there, staring, its presence an unspoken threat. Probably a local just trying to scare us, I'd said, though I didn't believe it even as the words left my mouth. The reservation was sparsely populated, and we'd informed everyone about the restricted access to the worksite. But Carlos seemed shaken, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching terror. For the rest of the day, he kept glancing over his shoulder, eyes darting around as if expecting the figure to return. His fear was contagious, spreading through the crew like a virus. I could feel a shift in the air, too, a sense of unease that seemed to settle over the entire crew like a heavy blanket. The land was tense, as though holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Even the equipment seemed to resist our efforts, motors running sluggish and belts slipping more often than they should. The land was tense, as though holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. On the third day, we started the pumps. The machinery groaned and rumbled as it sucked water from the reservoir, the heavy-duty hoses snaking into the depths of bitter water like mechanical serpents. The water that emerged was dark and oddly thick, nothing like the clear reservoir water we'd tested during the initial surveys. I stood by the control station, watching the gauges, listening to the rhythmic thrum of the pumps. The sound seemed to echo oddly across the water, distorting into something that almost resembled words. Then, the screaming started. It was Carlos. I turned just in time to see him stumble back from the reservoir's edge, his face twisted in terror. His hard hat fell from his head, rolling across the ground like a discarded toy. He was pointing at the water, his hand trembling, his voice a strangled whisper that barely carried over the sound of the pumps. He's there. He's watching. I followed his gaze to the edge of the water, but I saw nothing. Just the still, dark surface of the reservoir, reflecting the sun in a shimmer of light. Yet something about that reflection seemed wrong, as though the light was being bent and distorted by more than just the water's surface. "There's nothing there, Carlos," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, professional. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we were being watched by something just beyond our sight. The air had grown colder, despite the desert heat, and the wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. Carlos didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the water, his eyes wide and unblinking. When I touched his shoulder, his skin was ice cold, despite having worked in the sun all day. He didn't respond to his name, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. It took 2 other workers to lead him away from the water's edge, and even then, his eyes remained fixed on that spot where he claimed to have seen the figure. That night, I couldn't sleep. The desert was quiet, too quiet, as though every living thing had fled. The wind was still, the air heavy and suffocating. Even the coyotes, whose howls had become a familiar nighttime soundtrack, were silent. I lay in my tent, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the land pressing down on me. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, more oppressive, as though it had substance and weight of its own. Around midnight I heard footsteps. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but in the silence of the desert, they were deafening. I held my breath, straining to hear, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, each step sending a shiver down my spine. They didn't sound quite right. There was something off about their rhythm, as though whoever or whatever was making them wasn't quite used to walking. I sat up, my eyes scanning the darkness outside the tent. The moonlight cast strange shadows through the thin fabric, creating patterns that seemed to move and shift of their own accord. There was no one there, no movement, no shadow. But the footsteps continued, circling the campsite, moving from tent to tent, as though someone, or something, was watching us, waiting for us to fall asleep. The sound was accompanied by something else, a soft, dragging noise like wet cloth being pulled across sand. I stayed awake until dawn, my mind racing, the footsteps echoing in my ears. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure Carlos had described, standing motionless by the water's edge. When morning finally came, I stepped out of my tent, expecting to find nothing but empty sand and rocks, trying to convince myself that the night's terrors had been nothing more than stress and exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Instead, I found footprints, large, deep imprints in the earth, leading from the edge of the reservoir to each of our tents. They were fresh, the lines crisp and sharp, as though someone had walked through the camp in the dead of night. But there was something wrong about them. They were too deep, too widely spaced, and they seemed to hold water despite the bone-dry desert soil. When I knelt to examine them more closely, I caught a whiff of something rank and organic, like stagnant water and decay. Carlos refused to work that day. He sat on a rock staring out over the reservoir, his face pale and drawn. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just sat there, his eyes fixed on the water, as though he were waiting for something. When I brought him water, I noticed his hands were shaking, and his skin had taken on a grayish tinge. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his lips moved constantly, forming words I couldn't hear. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and mounting fear. More workers reported seeing the dark figure standing by the water's edge, watching them with unblinking eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Some swore they heard whispers, voices carried on the wind, calling them by name in tones that sounded almost familiar, yet fundamentally wrong. Others claimed to see shadows moving in the corners of their vision, figures that vanished the moment they turned to look, leaving only the lingering sensation of being watched. And then the accidents began. One of the pumps malfunctioned, the hoses snapping with explosive force, spraying water across the dry earth. The water that emerged was black and thick, and where it touched the ground, nothing would grow. Another worker slipped on the wet ground, breaking his ankle. When we examined his injury, the skin around the break was discolored and cold, as though the bones had been frozen from the inside. A truck's engine failed, stranding us miles from the nearest town. Its metal components corroded as though they'd been submerged in acid for years, rather than days. Each incident was small, seemingly insignificant when viewed in isolation, but together, they painted a picture of something I couldn't ignore. It was as though the land itself was fighting back, resisting our every attempt to drain the reservoir. The equipment failures grew more frequent, more severe, and there was always that sense of being watched, of being judged by something ancient and patient. And through it all, the figure watched. I'd see it out of the corner of my eye, a tall, dark silhouette standing by the water's edge. It never moved, never spoke. It simply stood there, waiting. Its presence was a constant pressure at the edge of my consciousness, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. Sometimes, when I looked at the water, I thought I could see it reflected there, its form distorted and stretched, reaching out with impossibly long limbs. By the end of the week, most of the crew had left. Only Carlos and a handful of others remained, their faces hollow and haunted. I knew I should leave too, that I should pack up and abandon the project. The risks were too high, the costs mounting with each passing day. But something kept me there, a sense of duty, of obligation, mixed with a morbid curiosity about what might happen if we continued. I had started this, and I had to see it through, even as I felt my grip on reality beginning to slip. On the final night, I stood by the edge of the reservoir, watching the water ripple under the starlight. The air was thick and heavy, the silence absolute. Even the insects had gone quiet, as though they knew what was coming. I could feel the weight of the land pressing down on me. I could feel the eyes of the watcher fixed on my back. The water seemed to pulse with its own inner rhythm, like a heart beating beneath the surface. And then, for the first time, I saw it clearly. It rose from the water, a figure of shadow and smoke, its form shifting and writhing like mist in the wind. Water cascaded from its body, but it didn't seem to get any drier. Instead, the liquid seemed to be part of its substance, flowing endlessly in impossible patterns. Its eyes were empty, hollow voids that seemed to swallow the light, and its mouth was twisted in a cruel, mocking smile that revealed too many teeth, all of them sharp and gleaming in the starlight. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was trapped, held in place by its gaze, its silent, mocking presence. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and thin, like claws, or perhaps like the roots of water plants, dripping with something that might have been water but seemed too thick, too dark. The air around it shimmed with an otherworldly heat, despite the bone-deep cold that had settled over the area. And at that moment, I understood. The land didn't want us here. The water didn't want to be taken. And the Watcher, he was just a messenger, a warning of the consequences that awaited anyone who disturbed the balance. This wasn't just about water rights or resource management. It was about respecting ancient boundaries, about understanding that some places aren't meant to be touched by human hands. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I knew I had to leave, that I had to get as far from bitter water as possible. But as I turned to run, I felt its fingers brush against my arm, cold and clammy, like the touch of death itself. The sensation burned like frostbite, sending waves of pain shooting through my body. The world spun around me, and the last thing I heard was a sound like rushing water, mixed with something that might have been laughter. I don't remember how I got back to camp, only that I woke up the next morning with a sharp pain in my arm, a dark bruise spreading across my skin in the shape of a handprint. The mark was cold to the touch, and in certain lights, I could swear I saw water moving beneath my skin, following patterns that made my eyes hurt to look at. The project was abandoned that day. The remaining crew left without a word, their faces pale and drawn, each of them marked in their own way by what they'd experienced. I was the last to leave, standing by the edge of the reservoir, staring out over the still, dark water. The pumps and equipment would rust there, slowly being reclaimed by the desert, a monument to human hubris. I could feel the Watcher's eyes on me, could feel his silent, mocking gaze. And as I turned to leave, I heard his voice, soft and mocking, echoing through the silence. It sounded like water flowing over stones, like the last breath of a drowning man. Leave. This place. I never returned to Bitterwater, but sometimes late at night I hear his voice, calling to me from the darkness, a reminder of the curse I had unleashed. The mark on my arm never fully healed. It remains cold to the touch, and in my darkest moments I swear I can feel it spreading, the water working its way deeper into my flesh. And I know, deep down, that he's still watching. Not just me, but all of us who would dare to think we can bend the natural world to our will. The Watcher of Bitterwater stands guard, a reminder that some places are sacred. Some waters are meant to remain undisturbed. In my dreams, I still see those eyes, still feel that cold touch. And I wonder sometimes if I ever really left that place at all, or if part of me will always remain there. Another sacrifice to the ancient guardian of those dark waters. When Jacob's parents sent him to stay with his grandparents for the summer, he was less than thrilled. At 17, he had little interest in the sleepy farm his grandparents had tended for decades, a lonely stretch of land surrounded by endless cornfields that whispered in the wind. The stalks stood tall and proud, their leaves rustling with every breeze like countless paper-thin hands brushing against each other. But after a rough semester and his parents' divorce, a bitter, drawn-out affair that had left emotional shrapnel embedded in everyone involved, his mother decided he needed time away from the city, away from everything. "It'll be good for you," she'd said, not meeting his eyes as she helped him pack. Some fresh air, some peace and quiet. The tremor in her voice betrayed her own uncertainty, but Jacob knew better than to argue. He'd seen enough arguments to last a lifetime. The farm itself was a study in isolation, sitting at the end of a long dirt road that seemed to stretch into infinity. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the closest town was little more than a collection of buildings huddled together against the vast expanse of farmland. The main house was a weathered two-story structure that had seen better days, its white paint peeling like old scabs, its windows staring out at the cornfields like tired eyes. Jacob had always known his grandparents' farm was old, but he hadn't realized how much history it held until he found the strange markings on the barn's weathered walls. They were faint and difficult to make out in the peeling paint, but they formed intricate patterns he couldn't quite decipher, spirals and symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Some looked almost like letters, others like crude drawings of human figures, all of them worn by decades of wind and rain. When he asked his grandfather about it, the old man's face clouded over, his usually warm brown eyes turning cold and distant. His grandfather's weathered hands, calloused from years of working the land, tightened on his coffee cup until his knuckles turned white. "That's not for you to worry about, Jacob," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant cornfield. "It's better if you leave those things alone." There was something in his voice that Jacob had never heard before, a mix of fear and resignation that made his stomach twist uncomfortably. Jacob let it go, but the mystery nagged at him like a loose tooth. There was something in the way his grandfather had looked at the cornfield, something in his voice, like a warning. It reminded him of how his father used to look just before another fight would break out at home. That same tension, that same unspoken dread. The first night Jacob lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the countryside. The usual hum of crickets and distant owl calls blended into the night like nature's lullaby. The old house creaked and settled around him, its wooden bones adjusting to the cooling air. His room was on the second floor, with a window that looked out over the cornfield. Moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting strange shadows on the walls. But as the clock inched closer to midnight, its red digital numbers casting a bloody glow in the darkness, another sound began, one that didn't belong in the symphony of night noises. It was a low, rustling whisper, soft but insistent, carried on the breeze from the cornfield outside his window. At first, it sounded like nothing more than the wind playing through the corn stalks, a natural phenomenon that any farmer would recognize. He strained his ears, telling himself it was just the wind moving through the stalks. But as he listened, he began to make out words. Just a few at first, faint and almost inaudible, like a radio station barely coming through the static. "Jacob. Come. Jacob." The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and a chill ran down his spine despite the summer warmth. He sat up in bed, straining to see anything beyond the window, but it was too dark. The corn stalks swayed in the darkness like dancers in a macabre ballet. He tried to convince himself that he'd misheard, that he was still half asleep and his mind was playing tricks on him. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was calling him. The rational part of his brain told him to stay in bed, to pull the covers over his head like a child and wait for morning. But curiosity gnawed at him, an insistent itch that wouldn't let him rest. Finally, he slipped on his shoes and crept out of the house, careful not to wake his grandparents. The ancient floorboards seemed to creak extra loudly under his feet, each step a thunderclap in the quiet house. Outside, the air was thick with humidity, clinging to his skin like a damp cloth. The moon cast an eerie glow over the fields, the cornstalks swaying gently in the night breeze. Their shadows danced across the ground, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like secret messages written in darkness. As he approached the edge of the field, the whispers grew louder, and he could swear he heard his name again, soft and pleading, like a lover's secret. "Jacob, come closer." He froze, heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The sound was unmistakable now, a voice calling from deep within the corn. It was too clear, too human to be a trick of the wind. And then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A faint, pulsing glow from somewhere in the middle of the field, like a heartbeat of light in the darkness. Against every instinct, every warning bell ringing in his head, he took a step into the rows of corn. The stalks rustled around him as he pushed forward, their leaves brushing against his face and arms like hungry fingers. The air grew cooler with each step, despite the summer night's warmth. The glow seemed to shift, moving deeper into the field, drawing him forward like a will-o'-the-wisp. With each step, the whispers grew louder, more desperate, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He stopped when he reached a small clearing, barely visible under the moonlight. The corn stalks around it were arranged in an unnaturally perfect circle, as though they had been planted that way deliberately. In the center of the clearing lay a pile of bones. Animal bones by the look of them, though something about their arrangement seemed purposeful, ritual. Some of them were fresh, still flecked with bits of flesh and blood that gleamed wetly in the moonlight. Others were old and yellowed, worn smooth by time and weather. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving him in a silence that felt deeper than any quiet he'd ever known. Even the crickets had fallen silent, as though they too sensed the wrongness of this place. The air grew thick and heavy, like breathing underwater. His heart hammered as he backed away, his breath catching in his throat. Panic seized him, and he turned and ran, crashing through the cornstalks, not caring about the noise he made or the leaves that whipped at his face. He didn't stop until he was safely back in his room, door locked, blankets pulled up to his chin like a shield against the darkness. He barely slept that night, haunted by the memory of those whispers and the bones lying in the moonlit clearing, arranged in patterns that seemed to mirror the markings on the barn. The next morning, Jacob tried to tell his grandfather about what he'd heard and seen, but the old man dismissed it with a wave of his hand, though his face had gone pale at Jacob's words. "You were probably dreaming, boy," he said, his voice gruff and dismissive, but his hands shook as he poured his coffee. "Or you let your mind run away with you. There's nothing out there but corn and wind. He wouldn't meet Jacob's eyes as he spoke, focusing instead on his breakfast with unusual intensity. But Jacob could see the fear in his grandfather's eyes, the way he avoided looking at the cornfield, as if there was something out there he didn't want to acknowledge. It was the same look his mother had worn when pretending everything was fine at home, even as his father's drinking got worse and the arguments grew more frequent. Over the next few days, Jacob tried to forget about the incident, throwing himself into farm work and helping his grandparents with their daily chores. But the whispers returned each night, drawing him closer to the field. They crept into his dreams, turning them into nightmares of endless corn rows and bones bleaching under a blood-red moon. He resisted at first, but the pull grew stronger, more insistent, like an addiction he couldn't shake. By the end of the week, he found himself standing at the edge of the field again, staring into the darkness, listening to the voices calling his name. They seemed different now, more numerous, as though others had joined the chorus. "Jacob, come to us." Against his better judgment, his feet carrying him forward as though they had a will of their own, he stepped into the field once more, moving deeper than he had before. The glow returned, faint and pulsing like a distant heartbeat, drawing him toward the clearing. He felt as though he were in a trance, unable to stop himself from moving forward, even as every rational thought screamed at him to turn back. When he reached the clearing, the pile of bones was gone, as though it had never been there at all. In its place lay a tattered, weathered piece of cloth, half buried in the dirt. It looked old, ancient even, like something that had been lying there for years. The fabric was a faded, indeterminate color, covered in symbols that matched the ones on the barn, and etched into the ground around it were more markings, forming a perfect circle that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. He knelt down, reaching out to touch the cloth, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion to make contact with this relic of the past. But a sudden voice stopped him, sharp and commanding. "Don't!" It hissed, cutting through the night air like a knife. He looked up, heart racing, to find his grandmother standing at the edge of the clearing, her face pale and drawn in the moonlight. She looked different somehow, older and more fragile, as though the weight of some terrible knowledge had aged her in an instant. "Leave it alone, Jacob," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, thick with fear and something else. Resignation, perhaps, or guilt. "Come away from there. Now." That night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that neither of them touched, Jacob's grandmother finally told him the truth about the farm. Her hands trembled as she spoke, clutching her rosary like a lifeline. "This land is cursed, Jacob," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Long before we came here, long before this was farmland, it belonged to a tribe who lived in these fields. They believed the land was sacred, a place where their ancestors walked, where the barrier between the world of the living and the dead was thin. But when settlers came, they drove the tribe away, destroyed their burial grounds, plowed their sacred land into fields." Her words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with the weight of generations of guilt and fear. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper, though he already knew the answer. "Because I didn't want you to be afraid," she replied, her eyes filled with sorrow and regret. We thought if we ignored it, if we pretended it wasn't happening, it would eventually stop. But it never does. And now you've seen it, heard the whispers. You've been marked, just like all the others." "What do they want?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling as he remembered the voices, the bones, the strange markings. "They want what was taken from them," his grandmother said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They want the land to be left alone, to rest in peace, and they won't stop until they get what they want." They've taken others before. Wanderers, travelers, children who strayed too close to the field at night. We tried to warn people, but who would believe us? Jacob tried to avoid the field after that, but the whispers grew louder each night, more desperate. They called to him, pleaded with him, their voices filled with anger and sorrow. They followed him into his dreams, turning them into nightmares of endless corn rows and faces, peering out from between the stalks, their eyes hollow and hungry. On the final night of his stay, the whispers reached a fever pitch. They filled his mind, drowning out everything else, leaving him unable to think, unable to breathe. The voices spoke in languages he didn't understand, yet somehow their meaning was clear. They wanted him, needed him, would never let him go. He stumbled out of bed, his body moving on its own, drawn toward the field like a moth to a flame. The moon was full, casting an otherworldly glow over the cornfield. The stalks seemed to bend toward him as he approached, reaching out like hungry fingers. He found himself standing in the clearing once more, the glow surrounding him, the whispers filling the air. And as he looked around, he saw figures emerging from the shadows, their forms flickering like candlelight. They were people, or what had once been people, their faces twisted with rage and grief, their bodies translucent in the moonlight. They reached out to him, their hands clawing at the air, their voices rising in a chorus of anger and sorrow that shook the very ground beneath his feet. "Give it back," they cried, their voices echoing in his mind like thunder. "Give it back." Jacob fell to his knees, his mind reeling, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make it stop. All he knew was that he was trapped, surrounded by spirits who wanted what he couldn't give, their land, their peace, their sacred ground. In the distance, he heard his grandfather's voice calling to him, faint and desperate. But it was too late. The whispers were all he could hear now, filling his mind, drowning out everything else, leaving him alone in the darkness with the angry dead. And as the spirits closed in, their cold touches sending shivers through his body, Jacob understood the truth, that he would never leave this place, that he would be bound to the field forever, just like them. He would become part of their endless vigil, another voice in the chorus of whispers that called to the living on dark nights. The next morning, Jacob's grandparents found his bed empty, his room cold and silent. They searched the fields, called his name until their voices gave out. But he was gone. The only trace they found was a single footprint at the edge of the clearing, as though he had simply stepped out of existence. His mother came, of course, and there were searches, questions, investigations, but no trace of Jacob was ever found. The police eventually concluded he had run away, unable to cope with his parents' divorce. Only his grandparents knew the truth, but who would believe them? And on the nights when the wind blows just right, when the moon is full and the corn stands tall, you can still hear his voice among the whispers. It calls out to passers-by, begging them to come, to join him in the darkness, to take his place in the field of bones. His voice mingles with the others now, part of the eternal chorus of the dispossessed, the angry, the forgotten. Some say that if you stand at the edge of the field on a quiet night, you can still see strange lights dancing between the corn rows, still hear voices calling your name. But the locals know better than to answer. They hurry past the old farm with their eyes averted, trying to ignore the whispers that follow them on the wind. And the corn grows tall and dark, feeding on secrets buried deep in the earth, waiting for the next visitor who strays too close to its whispering stalks. Rebecca had always loved the outdoors, especially solitary hikes that took her away from the noise of her life in the city. The wilderness had been her escape since childhood, a place where the constant chatter of phones and social media fell away, replaced by the pure, primal silence of nature. Her apartment in Phoenix felt like a cage sometimes, all steel and glass and artificial air. But out here in the vast expanse of Arizona's desert, she could finally breathe. When she stumbled upon an unmarked trail in Arizona's remote canyons, she saw it as an opportunity to explore something untouched, something wild. The trail wasn't on any of her maps or hiking apps, just a faint path worn into the red earth, beckoning her forward. There were no other hikers, no footprints, just a path that wound along the steep cliffs, following the natural contours of the canyon like a secret whispered into the landscape. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon walls, creating patterns that seemed to shift and change as she walked. The air was still cool, though she could feel the promise of heat building as the day progressed. Her boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, the only sound apart from the occasional cry of a distant hawk. The trail twisted and climbed until she reached a narrow ledge overlooking a drop of at least 100 feet. The view was breathtaking, layers of red and orange rock stretching to the horizon, carved by millions of years of wind and water into fantastic shapes. Across the ledge was a sheer rock face, its red stone marred only by a single startling mark, a handprint. The handprint was an eerie shade of dark red, barely visible against the stone, yet somehow drawing the eye like a beacon. It was ancient, maybe even painted with something organic that had withstood the test of time. Rebecca approached it, drawn by the strange, primal feeling it evoked in her. The rock face was smooth and cool to the touch, worn by countless years of desert winds. She reached out instinctively, her fingers hovering over the mark. Something about the handprint was unsettling. It was slightly larger than her own, with unnaturally long fingers that seemed to stretch beyond what was humanly possible. And despite its apparent age, it looked almost fresh, as though someone had just pressed their hand into the rock, leaving behind an impression that seemed to pulse with its own inner life. A chill ran down her spine despite the growing heat of the day. She pulled her hand back, suddenly aware of the canyon's silence. It was different now, heavier, more oppressive, as if something was watching her from the shadows of the cliff face. The wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness that made her skin crawl. Trying to shake off the feeling, she snapped a quick photo of the handprint with her phone. The screen flickered oddly as she took the picture, the image distorting for a split second before settling. She told herself it was just the harsh desert light playing tricks with the camera. That night she stayed at a nearby campsite, one of those basic setups with nothing but a flat patch of ground and a fire pit. The desert stars wheeled overhead, brilliant and cold, as she huddled in her tent with her phone, scrolling through the day's pictures. The photos of the canyon were beautiful. The layered rock, the deep shadows, the vast empty spaces that made her feel small and insignificant. When she reached the photo of the handprint, her screen flickered again, the image breaking up into static for a moment. A distorted shape appeared behind her own reflection in the screen, a dark mass that seemed to move independently of the image. She dismissed it as a trick of the camera, a glitch from the low light and desert dust. But just as she was about to put her phone away, she noticed something strange in the image. A faint, ghostly face in the cliffside, its hollow eyes fixed on her from behind the handprint. The face seemed to be emerging from the rock itself, as though the stone had become transparent, revealing something that had always been there, watching and waiting. Rebecca shivered, a feeling of dread settling over her like a cold blanket. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, just shadows and rock formations creating patterns that her mind was interpreting as a face. But as she lay there in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the desert, she couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The usual chorus of crickets and nocturnal creatures had fallen silent, leaving only the sound of her own breathing and the rapid beating of her heart. The next morning, Rebecca woke feeling exhausted, her sleep broken by strange dreams that left her feeling unsettled and drained. In her dreams, she'd been back on the ledge, the canyon stretching out below her like a wound in the earth, the wind howling in her ears with an almost human voice. She'd seen the handprint, but this time it was wet, fresh, glistening as though made with blood that had yet to dry. And there had been a figure, just beyond her vision, watching her from the shadows. Tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too angular to be human. Shaking off the lingering unease, she packed up her campsite and headed back to the trail. She wanted to revisit the ledge, to see the handprint in the morning light and reassure herself that it was nothing more than an old painting, perhaps left by ancient peoples who had lived in these canyons centuries ago. But as she approached the cliff, her unease grew. She couldn't explain it, but the air felt thicker, colder, as though something ancient and angry was waiting for her return. When she reached the ledge, her heart stopped. The handprint was there, just as before, its dark red color standing out against the stone. But there was something different this time. Next to the original print, there was a second handprint, smaller, fresher, and unmistakably hers. The shape matched her hand perfectly, down to the small scar on her palm from a childhood accident. She stared, frozen, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She hadn't touched the cliff yesterday. She'd come close, but she hadn't left a mark. And yet, the handprint was a perfect replica of her own hand, pressed into the stone next to the ancient print, as though she had left a piece of herself behind, a signature she couldn't remember writing. Rebecca stumbled back, her pulse racing, her eyes darting around the canyon. The silence was complete now, not even the wind disturbing the stillness. She was alone, miles from the nearest town, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her, hiding just out of sight in the countless shadows and crevices that scarred the canyon walls. As she backed away, her foot slipped on the loose gravel that covered the ledge. She caught herself instinctively, her hand pressing against the cliff face for balance. When she pulled it away, her palm tingled, a strange, burning sensation spreading across her skin like ice slowly melting into fire. She glanced down, expecting to see a scrape or cut, but there was nothing there. The skin was unmarked, yet the burning grew stronger, spreading up her arm like poison in her veins, leaving her feeling as though something was crawling beneath her skin. Rebecca turned and hurried down the trail, her only thought to put as much distance between herself and the handprint as possible. She didn't look back, didn't stop until she reached her car, the canyon looming behind her like a silent, watchful presence. The burning in her hand had subsided to a dull ache, but she could still feel it, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. That night, back at her small hotel room in town, the burning in her hand returned, sharper and more intense than before. She splashed cold water over her palm, trying to ease the discomfort, but the pain only grew worse, spreading through her arm and into her shoulder like liquid fire. She gritted her teeth, trying to ignore it, but when she looked at her hand under the harsh bathroom light, she saw it. A faint red stain in the shape of a handprint, burned into her skin like a brand. Panic surged through her. She scrubbed at her hand with soap and water, then alcohol wipes from her first aid kit, trying to remove the stain. But it was no use. It was like the mark was inside her, etched beneath her skin, a part of her now. And as she stared at it, she heard something. A faint whisper, barely audible, drifting through the silence of her room. "Come back." The words sent a chill down her spine, and she stumbled back, clutching her marked hand to her chest, her mind racing. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, that the day's events and her lack of sleep were playing tricks on her mind. But the whisper grew louder, repeating over and over, filling her head with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. The following day, Rebecca decided to leave town, to put as much distance between herself and the canyon as possible. She packed up quickly, her hands shaking as she threw her things into her bag, glancing nervously over her shoulder as though expecting to see something lurking in the shadows of her hotel room. But as she loaded her things into her car, she noticed something strange in her reflection in the driver's side window. Her face looked pale, almost ghostly, her eyes hollow and dark like empty sockets. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the reflection remained, distorted and twisted, like something was staring back at her from within the glass, something that wore her face like a mask. The drive was tense, each mile taking her further from the canyon but never easing the heavy feeling in her chest. She glanced at her rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see a figure standing in the road behind her, tall and thin with impossibly long fingers. But there was nothing, just the empty stretch of desert, silent and unyielding under the merciless sun. That night, the dreams returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. She was back on the ledge, staring at the handprint, but this time, it was alive, pulsing with a dark energy that seeped into her, filling her with a sense of despair and longing. And in the shadows, she saw it, a figure, tall and thin, its eyes hollow pits that seemed to swallow light, its hand stretched out toward her, reaching for her, calling her name in a voice that sounded like wind through empty bones. When she awoke, drenched in sweat despite the hotel room's air conditioning, the handprint on her palm had darkened, spreading across her skin like a bruise. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she clutched her hand, feeling the weight of the mark pressing into her, like something was trying to pull her back to the canyon, back to whatever waited for her there. Days passed, each one worse than the last. The handprint grew darker, more defined, until it covered her entire palm, a mark of something ancient and malevolent that had claimed her as its own. And the whisper followed her, growing louder each night, filling her dreams with visions of the canyon and the thing that waited there, urging her to return, to come back and face whatever fate awaited her. Rebecca knew she couldn't ignore it forever. The pull was too strong, the mark too deep, like a hook in her soul drawing her back to the place where it all began. She packed a small bag and drove back to the canyon, her mind racing with possibilities, her body trembling with equal parts fear and anticipation. When she arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cliffs that seemed to reach for her like grasping fingers. She made her way to the ledge, her heart pounding with each step, the whispers growing louder until they filled her mind completely, drowning out all other thoughts. At the ledge, the handprints were waiting, both hers and the ancient mark, side by side, like two hands reaching out from the stone. And as she stared, the figure emerged from the gathering darkness, stepping from the shadows as though they were a doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on her, its hand raised in silent greeting, fingers impossibly long and twisted. Rebecca felt a strange sense of calm wash over her as she reached out, her marked hand meeting the cold, unyielding stone. The world around her faded, the canyon dissolving into darkness, until there was nothing left but the handprint, the mark that had claimed her, binding her to the cliffs forever. And when the search party found her car days later, parked at the trailhead with her belongings untouched, they followed her tracks to the ledge. But Rebecca was gone, vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. All that remained was a faint red handprint on the cliff, a third mark now joining the others, a final signature of her presence, a warning to anyone who dared disturb the silent, watchful spirit of the canyon. Some say that on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the shadows grow long, you can still hear whispers on the wind, calling out to those who venture too close to the ledge. And if you look carefully at the cliff face, you might see them, the handprints, growing in number, each one a story, each one a soul claimed by whatever ancient thing dwells in the depths of the canyon, forever watching, forever waiting for the next visitor to reach out and touch the mark it left behind. Jake had spent most of his life in the mountains, but this was the first time he'd been this far north. Growing up in Colorado's Rockies had given him a deep respect for wilderness, but the Montana backcountry felt fundamentally different, older, somehow, and heavier, like it had been waiting for centuries, untouched by human hands. The trees here seemed taller, their shadows deeper, the silence between them more profound. He and his friends had planned this trip for months, a week of backpacking and camping in one of the most remote areas of the state, far from the tourist trails and designated campgrounds. There were 5 of them: Jake, his girlfriend Anna, and 3 friends, Mike, Sarah, and Eric. They'd all met in their college hiking club 3 years ago, bonding over their love of the outdoors. Anna was the botanist, always stopping to photograph interesting plants. Mike was their navigator, religiously checking their GPS coordinates against old topographical maps. Sarah was the group's photographer, her camera constantly capturing the raw beauty of the landscape. Eric was their resident survival expert, having spent summers working as a park ranger. But as they made their way deeper into the forest, following an old hunting trail they'd found on a map dated 1947, an unsettling quiet settled over the group. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent, leaving only the soft crunch of their boots on the forest floor and the occasional whisper of wind through the ancient pines. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, carrying the musty scent of decay and something else. Something older, more primal. By the 3rd day, they had reached a narrow valley surrounded by towering trees, their trunks wide as cars, their branches forming a dense canopy that filtered the sunlight into strange, shifting patterns on the forest floor. Jake suggested they set up camp by a stream running through the valley, the water clear and cold, tumbling over moss-covered rocks. It seemed like a perfect spot for their last night in the wilderness before heading back. As they began setting up their tents, Anna wandered to the edge of the stream and froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her gaze fixed on a cluster of tall, weathered poles standing just beyond the water, partially hidden by the undergrowth. Each pole was carved with intricate designs, symbols that twisted and coiled around the wood, forming shapes she couldn't quite make out. They looked ancient, almost forgotten, the wood gray and weathered but somehow untouched by rot. "Hey, Jake," she called, waving him over, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at these." Jake joined her, his eyes narrowing as he studied the poles. The carvings seemed to shift in the filtered sunlight, creating patterns that made his eyes hurt if he looked at them too long. "Totems," he murmured, the hair on the back of his neck prickling. "Native, by the look of them. But I've never seen anything like this." The symbols weren't like anything he'd encountered in his studies of Native American culture. They seemed older, more primitive, as if they'd been carved by hands that had never known civilization. Mike and the others joined them, staring at the poles with a mix of fascination and unease. Sarah raised her camera, but something made her lower it again without taking a photo. "Think it's a burial site?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed, as if afraid the very air might carry her words too far. Jake shrugged, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't supposed to be there. The totems seemed to watch them with invisible eyes, their presence a silent warning. He wanted to suggest moving camp, maybe going back down the trail, but it was late, and they were all exhausted from 3 days of hard hiking. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and blood red. So they set up their tents by the stream, keeping their voices low, as though afraid of disturbing whatever lay in the shadows beyond the totems. That night, Jake woke to the sound of footsteps outside his tent. At first, he thought it was one of his friends, maybe going to fetch water from the stream. But as he listened, his heart beginning to pound against his ribs, he realized that the footsteps were slow and heavy, moving deliberately around the tents in a wide circle. They didn't sound quite right. The rhythm was off, as if whoever or whatever was walking had legs of different lengths, or moved in a way that wasn't quite human. He held his breath, straining to hear, but the footsteps faded, disappearing into the silence like they'd never been there at all. He lay awake for a long time, staring into the darkness, the quiet pressing in on him like a physical weight. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with strange images, faces he didn't recognize, hollow eyes staring at him from the shadows, mouths open in silent screams. He dreamed of the totems, their carvings coming alive, writhing like snakes in the moonlight. The next morning, he was quiet as he packed up his gear, his movements mechanical, his mind still haunted by the dreams. But when he saw Anna and Sarah exchanging uneasy glances, their faces pale in the early morning light, he knew he wasn't the only one who'd heard the footsteps. They didn't talk about it, but the tension lingered, an unspoken understanding that something was watching them, following their movements with patient, ancient eyes. They left the valley, following the trail up a ridge, hoping to make it to the other side before nightfall. But the day passed slowly, each mile feeling longer than the last, as though the forest itself were trying to hold them back. The trail seemed to wind in circles, doubling back on itself despite what their compass showed. Even Mike, usually so confident with navigation, seemed confused, checking and rechecking the map with growing frustration. And then, as the sun began to dip below the treetops, casting long shadows across their path, Jake saw it. A tall, shadowy figure standing among the trees, just off the trail. It was too far to make out any details, but he could feel its gaze, heavy and cold, like a warning. The figure seemed to be made of shadow itself, its edges blurring into the darkness between the trees. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Anna followed his gaze, her face paling as she caught sight of the figure. What is that?" Her hand found his, gripping it tightly, her fingers cold despite the warm afternoon air. Jake didn't answer. He didn't know, didn't want to know. He just wanted to get out of the forest, to leave whatever spirit walked those woods behind. But deep down, he knew it wasn't going to be that simple. They had crossed some invisible line, violated some ancient taboo, and now they would have to face the consequences. As they pressed on, the forest grew darker, the shadows stretching longer, twisting into strange shapes that seemed to reach for them with grasping fingers. The figure appeared again and again, always at the edge of their vision, watching from the cover of the trees, moving silently along with them. Each time they caught a glimpse of it, it seemed closer, its hollow eyes fixed on them, unblinking. Sometimes they could hear it moving through the underbrush, its footsteps matching the strange rhythm from the night before. By nightfall, the group was on edge, their nerves frayed, their voices hushed. They camped in silence, their tents clustered close together, the fire crackling weakly in the center of their circle. No one spoke, each of them listening, straining for the sound of footsteps, for the whisper of movement in the darkness. Eric tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but his laugh sounded forced, hollow, and died quickly in the oppressive silence. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they had trespassed, that they were somewhere they weren't supposed to be. He thought of the totems, the intricate carvings, the hollow eyes that had watched them all day. It was as though the forest itself had a guardian, an ancient spirit who didn't take kindly to strangers. He remembered stories his grandfather had told him about sacred places, about spirits that protected the old lands, about the price paid by those who didn't show proper respect. In the early hours of the morning, Jake awoke to a soft, rhythmic whisper. At first he thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but as he listened he realized it was a voice, low and deep, speaking in a language he didn't understand. The words seemed to slither through the air like smoke, carrying meanings too dark and ancient for human minds to grasp. It moved through the camp, circling them, growing louder with each pass, filling the night with its strange, haunting cadence. He sat up, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the dying embers of their fire. And then he saw it, the figure, standing just beyond the firelight, tall and thin, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its mouth moving as it whispered. Its form seemed to shift and change, sometimes appearing solid, sometimes transparent, like smoke caught in a breeze. He froze, unable to look away, unable to move. The figure raised a hand, beckoning him, its long fingers curling like claws, its voice rising to a chant, a dark droning sound that filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts. The words seemed to carry images, flashes of ancient ceremonies, of blood on stone, of sacrifices made in the deep woods where no one could hear the screams. He heard a gasp from behind him, and he turned to see Anna, her face pale as milk, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the figure. In the dim light, he could see tears tracking down her cheeks. "Do you see it?" she whispered, her voice trembling, her hand clutching his arm so tightly it hurt. Jake nodded, his throat dry, his heart racing. He reached out, pulling her close, his eyes never leaving the figure. But as he watched, it began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows like mist, leaving only the echo of its chant in the cold, silent air. The whispers lingered, though, carried on the wind, speaking of ancient things, of forgotten powers, of prices that must be paid. The next morning they broke camp at first light, their faces drawn, their eyes haunted by what they'd seen. No one spoke as they packed up, their hands trembling, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. They moved quickly, eager to leave the forest, to escape the watchful eyes that followed them from the shadows. Even Mike had given up on the map, simply pointing them in what he hoped was the right direction. But the forest wasn't finished with them. As they neared the edge of the trees, Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on something buried in the undergrowth. She looked down, and her scream pierced the air, sending a chill through the group, a sound of pure terror that seemed to echo forever in the ancient silence. There, half buried in the dirt, was a skull, its hollow eyes staring up at them, its mouth open in a silent scream. The bone was yellowed with age, covered in a thin layer of moss, but unmistakably human. The sight of it froze them in place, horror twisting their faces as they realized what they were seeing. They backed away, but the forest was full of bones, skulls and ribs and shattered femurs, scattered across the ground, hidden beneath the moss and leaves. It was a graveyard, ancient and forgotten, the final resting place of those who had crossed the spirit and paid the price. Some of the bones showed marks, deep grooves and scratches that looked like they'd been made by something impossibly strong, something with claws that could tear through bone like paper. And as they stood there, frozen in fear, the whisper returned, filling the air with its low, rhythmic chant. The figure appeared again, its hollow eyes fixed on them, its hand raised in silent warning. Behind it, other shapes began to emerge from the shadows, transparent forms that might once have been human, their faces twisted in eternal agony. One by one they turned and ran, their footsteps pounding through the forest, the whisper following them, growing louder, filling their minds with its dark, ancient call. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs trembled, until the forest finally began to thin and they could see daylight ahead. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the forest, gasping for breath, their hearts racing, their minds reeling from what they'd seen. They didn't look back, didn't speak. They just kept moving, desperate to escape, to leave the forest and its spirit behind. Even when they reached their car, even when they were miles away on the highway, they could still feel it. The weight of those hollow eyes, the echo of that ancient chant. But as they fled, they knew they would never be truly free. The spirit had marked them, bound them to the forest with its dark magic. Its hollow eyes would watch them forever, its chant filling their dreams, a dark, inescapable reminder of the price they had paid for trespassing on sacred ground. They carried something back with them, something ancient and terrible, a knowledge that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And every so often, when they closed their eyes, they would see it. The figure standing in the shadows, waiting, watching, whispering its dark, ancient song. Sometimes, in the depths of night, they would wake to the sound of those heavy, uneven footsteps circling their homes, and they would know that distance meant nothing to the spirit that walked the ancient woods. It had found them once, and it would find them again, patient and eternal, waiting for the day they would return to pay the final price for their trespass. For in the deep woods of Montana, where the old spirits still walk, some boundaries should never be crossed. Some places should remain untouched, and some secrets should stay buried in the dark earth beneath the ancient trees. Maggie and Dan had been dreaming of their own slice of the countryside for years, a place far from the city's noise and endless rush. Their cramped apartment in Kansas City had begun to feel like a prison, with its constant traffic noise and the suffocating press of humanity on all sides. Every weekend, they'd drive out into the rural areas, imagining themselves in a little house surrounded by nothing but open space and endless sky. So, when they found a plot of land in rural Kansas, 30 untouched acres surrounded by wild hills and dense woodlands, they didn't hesitate. The price was low, suspiciously so, but they were too excited to question their good fortune. The land was remote and peaceful, undisturbed by human hands for what seemed like generations. They saw it as the perfect escape, a blank canvas where they could build their life together. The only structure on the property was an old barn, hidden away in a hollow near a dense cluster of ancient oak trees, whose branches twisted together like gnarled fingers. The barn had stood there for as long as anyone could remember, its wooden planks weathered and faded to a deep gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its frame listed to one side as though it were bowing under the weight of decades, the roof sagging like a broken spine. The locals called it the old burial ground, but when Maggie and Dan asked about it, they were met with shrugged shoulders and vague answers, eyes that wouldn't quite meet theirs. Old folklore, the realtor had said with a wave of her hand, though Maggie noticed how she never got too close to the barn during their viewings. People around here are full of stories. Don't let it bother you. But there was something in her voice, a tension that suggested she knew more than she was willing to share. Maggie had brushed it off at the time, eager to start their new life. But now, standing in the shadow of the barn, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. There was something about the place that felt off. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, and the trees seemed to lean in close, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward her. Even the birds fell silent when they approached this part of the property, as though they knew better than to disturb whatever slept in the shadows of that ancient structure. "Come on," Dan called from the clearing, his voice breaking her trance. He stood in the sunlight, clipboard in hand, looking every bit the architect he was. "We need to get started if we're going to have the house up by winter," She shook off her unease, forcing a smile as she joined him. They spent the day marking the land for construction, talking excitedly about where the kitchen would go, the bedroom, the windows that would look out over the hills. Dan's enthusiasm was infectious, and for a while, Maggie could almost forget the oppressive presence of the barn. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground, she found herself glancing back at it, its dark silhouette looming like a silent witness to their plans. That night, as they sat around a small fire outside their temporary trailer, Maggie brought it up, voicing her unease for the first time. The flames cast flickering shadows across their faces, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, the sound echoing through the hills like a cry of warning. "Do you think there's any truth to what the locals said about this being a burial ground?" Dan laughed, but it was a nervous sound that died quickly in the darkness. "Old superstitions," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "People around here are just used to seeing the places haunted, I guess. Probably some rumor from back when settlers first came through." But his eyes kept drifting to the barn, barely visible in the darkness, a deeper shadow against the night sky. Maggie nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as though the land was holding its breath, waiting for something. The fire seemed to burn lower when she looked toward the barn, the flames bending away as though trying to escape something only they could sense. In the days that followed, they started clearing the land, cutting down trees, moving rocks, making way for the foundation of their dream home. As they worked, they began finding strange things. Small, weathered stones arranged in neat rows, too regular to be natural. Animal bones buried in shallow graves, arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate. Even an old arrowhead etched with intricate patterns that made Maggie's eyes hurt if she looked at them too long. Each discovery felt like a warning, like the land was trying to tell them something through these ancient artifacts. The stones were always warm to the touch, even on cold mornings, and sometimes Maggie swore she could feel them pulse, like a distant heartbeat buried in the earth. And then, one evening, as the sun was setting and the shadows were growing long, Maggie found it. She had been digging near the barn, clearing a space for the driveway, when her shovel hit something hard with a sound that seemed to echo through the hollow. She knelt down, brushing away the dirt, her heart pounding as she uncovered a skull. It was small, delicate, the bones weathered with age, but unmistakably human. But what unnerved her most were the deep carvings on the surface, strange, twisting symbols that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them, like they were alive somehow, trying to tell her something she couldn't, or shouldn't, understand. Dan found her staring at it, her face pale, her hands trembling as they held the ancient bone. The skull seemed to glow faintly in the dying light, the carvings catching the last rays of sun in ways that didn't quite make sense. "Probably just an animal skull," he said, though his voice was uncertain, cracking slightly on the last word. "People find them all the time around here. This land has been here for centuries after all." But Maggie could see the fear in his eyes, the way his gaze kept darting to the barn, as though expecting to see something lurking in its shadowed doorway. They buried the skull near the edge of the property, beneath an old oak tree whose branches seemed to reach down like grasping hands. They told themselves it was nothing, just an artifact of a forgotten time. But that night, Maggie dreamed of the barn. She saw it standing in a field of bones, its doorway open like a mouth, a dark figure watching her from the shadows. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at strange angles and eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness. She tried to run, but her feet sank into the ground, pulling her down, burying her in the cold, damp earth that seemed to whisper with 1,000 voices. The next morning, they found the first mark. It was a simple handprint, pressed into the mud just outside the barn. But there was something wrong about it. It was too large to be Maggie's and too slender to be Dan's. The fingers unnaturally long and jointed in places where human fingers shouldn't bend. They stared at it, unease twisting in their stomachs. But Dan brushed it off as nothing, though his voice trembled slightly. "Probably just some local kid messing around," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We're the new people in town. They're bound to try and scare us." But his laugh was hollow, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as they walked back to the trailer. But as they continued their work, more marks began to appear. Handprints, footprints, symbols carved into the dirt that matched the ones on the skull, all leading from the barn to the spot where they'd buried it. The marks appeared overnight, no matter how carefully they smoothed the ground before sunset. And sometimes they seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, like they were trying to form words in a language too ancient for human tongues. And every night, Maggie's dreams grew darker, filled with whispers and shadowy figures, their faces twisted in silent rage. She would wake gasping, covered in cold sweat, the taste of earth in her mouth, and the feeling of dirt filling her lungs. Sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, she would see the figure from the barn standing in the corner of their bedroom, watching with those burning eyes. Dan tried to reassure her, but Maggie could see the strain in his face, the way he jumped at every noise, his eyes flicking constantly toward the barn. She could feel it too, a growing tension, a weight pressing down on them, as though the land itself were angry, unwilling to let them stay. The very air seemed to grow thicker, harder to breathe, filled with the scent of decay and something else, something older and more terrible. A week later, they awoke to find the handprints smeared across their trailer's door. They were dark, almost black, the marks fading as they trailed down the metal, as though something had dragged itself up from the earth, clawing its way to the surface. They seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and when Maggie reached out to touch one, her fingers came away stained with something that looked like soil, but felt warm and wet, like fresh blood. "We should leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her pounding heart. "This isn't right, Dan. We shouldn't be here. The land, it doesn't want us here." But Dan was stubborn, his pride and dreams making him blind to the danger. He insisted that it was just their minds playing tricks on them, that they were letting the local stories get into their heads. But Maggie could see the fear in his eyes, the way he avoided looking at the barn, as though afraid of what he might see looking back. That night, as they lay in bed, Maggie heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from outside the window. The sound was deliberate, almost musical, like someone playing a tune on hollow bones. She held her breath, straining to listen, her heart racing as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. She reached for Dan, her hand trembling, but he was already awake, his face pale in the moonlight. Together, they crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. And there, standing just beyond the barn, was a figure, a tall, thin silhouette that seemed to bend in impossible ways, its face hidden in shadow, its hand raised, tapping against the glass in slow, deliberate strokes. The moonlight seemed to bend around it, creating a halo of darkness that made Maggie's eyes water when she tried to look directly at it. Maggie stifled a scream, pulling Dan back, her mind racing, her body trembling. The figure stood motionless, watching them, its hollow eyes fixed on them with a cold, unyielding gaze that seemed to pierce through walls and flesh alike. The next morning, they decided to leave. They packed their things quickly, their movements frantic, their breaths shallow and panicked. The air in the trailer felt thick and heavy, like breathing underwater, and every shadow seemed to move with purpose, reaching for them with dark, twisted fingers. But as they made their way to the car, They found it covered in handprints, each one dark and smeared, as though something had tried to claw its way inside. The metal was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, and the prints seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Desperate, they ran back to the trailer, locking the doors, their hearts pounding as they waited, their eyes fixed on the windows, expecting to see the figure watching them. The day seemed to darken around them, though it was barely noon, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the ground, they heard it. A soft, low whisper that seemed to come from the earth itself, drifting through the trailer, filling every corner, every shadow. "You don't belong here." The whisper grew louder, rising to a chant, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They spoke in languages long forgotten, their words carrying the weight of centuries of anger and pain. The voices filled their minds, their thoughts, drowning out everything else until Maggie couldn't remember why they had come here, why they had dared to disturb this ancient place. They clutched each other, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror, as the trailer filled with dark, twisting shadows, each one moving closer, reaching out with bony, skeletal hands. The air grew thick with the smell of earth and decay, and Maggie could feel the ground beneath them shifting, as though something were trying to pull them down into the depths. The last thing they saw was the figure, standing in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on them, a cold, mocking smile twisting its lips into something that was almost human, but not quite. Its body seemed to shift and change in the darkness, sometimes tall and thin, sometimes bent and twisted, but always wrong, always ancient and terrible. And when the townspeople found the trailer the next morning, drawn by an unnatural silence that had fallen over the land, it was empty. The rooms were silent and cold, the walls marked with dark, smeared handprints that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The air was thick with the smell of earth and something older, something that made them turn away and cross themselves, muttering prayers under their breath. But in the barn, hidden beneath a shallow layer of earth, they found two skulls, each one etched with strange, twisting symbols that hurt the eyes to look at, each one marked with a single dark handprint, a final reminder of the spirits who had claimed their land, and the price paid by those who dared to disturb their rest. The land stands empty now, the barn still watching over its secrets. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the trees, people say they can see figures moving in the shadows, tall and thin and wrong, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. And if you listen carefully, you might hear voices calling from the earth, speaking in tongues long forgotten, warning others to stay away from this hallowed ground. For the land remembers, and the spirits that dwell there never forget those who dare to build upon their sacred soil. They wait in the shadows, patient and eternal, ready to claim those who ignore their warnings, adding new bones to their ancient collection, new voices to their endless chorus of the damned.